Jonathan Armand was the epitome of success, a man whose life was the envy of many. Born into privilege, he had inherited his father's thriving business empire and multiplied its worth through shrewd investments and relentless ambition. At 45, Jonathan owned luxury cars, sprawling estates, and an exclusive membership to every prestigious club in the city. His name was synonymous with power and influence, a status that ensured doors opened for him wherever he went. Yet, for all his wealth and acclaim, Jonathan felt a growing emptiness gnawing at him, a void that no amount of money or recognition could fill. The turning point came one winter evening as Jonathan attended a glittering charity gala in his honor. The event was a celebration of his generous donations to homeless shelters and food banks, an annual tradition that reinforced his public image as a benevolent figure. As he mingled with elegantly dressed guests and posed for photographs, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling of detachment that clung to him like a shadow. The speeches praising his contributions felt hollow, the clinking glasses of champagne rang empty, and the carefully curated event seemed more a performance than a sincere effort to address the problems it claimed to solve. Later that night, as Jonathan's limousine glided through the city streets, he caught sight of a figure huddled beneath a bridge. The man's skeletal frame was barely visible under layers of tattered fabric, his face etched with despair and weathered by years of hardship. The image stayed with Jonathan, haunting his thoughts even as he returned to the warmth of his mansion. It was not the first time he had seen a homeless person, but for reasons he couldn't explain, this encounter struck a chord deep within him. Questions began to bubble to the surface. Could his donations truly make a difference if he had no understanding of the struggles they were meant to alleviate? How could he claim to help the poor when he had never faced hunger, homelessness, or hopelessness? In the days that followed, Jonathan became consumed by these thoughts. He began observing the city with a more critical eye, noticing the sharp divide between the wealthy and the destitute. He realized that his life of privilege had insulated him from the harsh realities of those less fortunate. The idea of bridging this gap took root in his mind, a radical, almost reckless notion. What if he left his life behind, even temporarily, to live as a beggar? What if he stripped away his wealth and influence to experience the world from the other side? The plan began to take shape slowly. Jonathan knew it would not be easy. He would need to disappear without drawing suspicion, disguising himself so thoroughly that even those closest to him wouldn't recognize him. He procured old, tattered clothes from a thrift store in a distant part of town, smudging dirt into the fabric to make them look more authentic. He studied the mannerisms and speech patterns of the homeless, watching from afar as they navigated the city streets. Finally, he prepared a small bundle of supplies, a bottle of water, a few granola bars, and a hidden stash of cash, enough to ensure he wouldn't starve but small enough to keep him in the mindset of scarcity. On the morning of his departure, Jonathan stood before the mirror in his master bedroom, gazing at his reflection. The man staring back at him was a far cry from the polished figure he had always presented to the world. His usually impeccable suit was replaced by a threadbare jacket, his neatly combed hair now disheveled and streaked with grime. A mixture of excitement and trepidation coursed through him as he took a final look around the room. He left behind his phone, his credit cards, and all the trappings of his identity. Clutching his bundle, he slipped out of the mansion before dawn, unnoticed by the household staff. Stepping onto the street, Jonathan felt a jarring sense of disorientation. For the first time in his life, he was truly anonymous, just another face in the crowd. The indifference of the city was palpable. People brushed past him without a second glance, their hurried footsteps a stark contrast to the deferential treatment he was accustomed to. It was both liberating and unsettling. He wandered aimlessly through the streets, observing the world from his new perspective. He noticed things he had never paid attention to before: the peeling paint on old buildings, the exhaustion etched into the faces of street vendors, and the subtle dance of avoidance as passers-by skirted around beggars. By evening, Jonathan found himself under the same bridge where he had first seen the old beggar. The man was no longer there, but a small group of homeless individuals had gathered, seeking shelter from the biting cold. They sat huddled around a makeshift fire, sharing what little food they had managed to scavenge. Summoning his courage, Jonathan approached them, his heart pounding. The group eyed him warily, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. He offered them one of his granola bars, a gesture that seemed to ease their skepticism. They allowed him to join their circle, though they remained cautious. As the night wore on, Jonathan listened to their conversations, absorbing their stories of loss, resilience, and survival. Each tale was a window into a world he had never truly understood. The hardships they described were harrowing, yet their camaraderie and humor in the face of adversity were deeply moving. That night, as Jonathan lay on the cold, hard ground with nothing but a thin blanket for warmth, he felt a profound sense of vulnerability. The discomfort was overwhelming, but beneath it was a flicker of something new, a connection to the raw, unfiltered reality of life. Jonathan's journey had only just begun, but already he sensed that it would change him in ways he couldn't yet fathom. The luxurious world he had left behind felt distant, almost unreal. Here, among those society often overlooked, he was beginning to see life through a lens he had never known existed. The days and nights Jonathan spent on the streets were nothing like he had imagined. Initially, he believed that his greatest challenges would be hunger, cold, and physical discomfort. He soon realized, however, that the psychological and social aspects of his new life were far more demanding. Each morning began with a gnawing emptiness, not just in his stomach, but in his sense of identity. As a beggar, he was stripped of the privilege that once defined him. People avoided his gaze, treated him as if he were invisible, or, worse, regarded him with open contempt. The indifference of strangers cut deeper than the chill of winter, reminding him daily of the vast divide between his former world and the one he now inhabited. One of the first lessons Jonathan learned was the fragility of dignity. Early in his disguise, he had been too proud to ask for help, his ego stubbornly clinging to remnants of his old self. But the streets had little patience for pride. Hunger gnawed at him until he found himself sitting on a street corner, cupping his hands and mumbling a hesitant request for spare change. At first, the act of begging felt dehumanizing. Each coin tossed at him more like an act of pity than kindness. Over time, however, he began to notice the small gestures of humanity that punctuated his days. A smile from a passerby, a few extra coins dropped by someone who paused to make eye contact. These moments, though fleeting, became lifelines in a world that otherwise seemed indifferent. Jonathan's days were filled with survival tasks that once seemed unthinkable. He scavenged through trash bins for discarded food, quickly learning which neighborhoods were more likely to yield edible scraps. Public restrooms became sanctuaries where he could clean himself, albeit inadequately, to maintain some semblance of hygiene. He formed a routine, wandering the city in search of places to rest, and avoiding areas patrolled by security guards or police who viewed beggars as nuisances. Despite the constant struggle, he began to notice the unspoken rules of life on the streets. Spaces under bridges or in abandoned buildings were claimed by invisible boundaries, and newcomers had to navigate these territories carefully to avoid conflict. The relationships he formed were both unexpected and transformative. The small group of homeless individuals he first met under the bridge became his companions, a makeshift family that shared their meager resources and offered him invaluable lessons in survival. There was Marla, a middle-aged woman whose sharp wit masked a deep sadness stemming from years of abuse and betrayal. Her knowledge of the city's soup kitchens and shelters proved invaluable. Then there was Greg, a former construction worker who had lost everything to a gambling addiction. Greg took Jonathan under his wing, teaching him how to stay warm by layering newspaper under his clothes and where to find the best spots for collecting recyclable cans to exchange for cash. Lastly, there was Benny, a wiry teenager who had run away from an abusive home and survived on sheer resourcefulness. Benny's stories of resilience and determination moved Jonathan deeply, forcing him to confront the privileges he had taken for granted. Through these relationships, Jonathan began to see the humanity in those he had once regarded as the needy. They were not defined by their circumstances, but by their strength, humor, and the bonds they formed with one another. Despite their hardships, they displayed remarkable generosity. Marla often shared her food, even when she had little, while Greg used his limited earnings to buy medicine for Benny when the boy fell ill. These acts of kindness stood in stark contrast to the cold, transactional relationships Jonathan had known in his former life. The lessons he learned from them began to shift his perspective, planting seeds of empathy and humility. Yet, life on the streets was not without its dangers. One night, while sleeping in an alleyway, Jonathan was awakened by the sound of shouting. A confrontation between two men escalated into violence, and though he managed to escape unscathed, the incident left him shaken. He realized how vulnerable he truly was, and for the first time, he felt genuine fear for his safety. Another day, while waiting in line at a soup kitchen, Jonathan witnessed an elderly man collapse from exhaustion and hunger. The sight was a harsh reminder of the fragility of life in this world. These experiences, while harrowing, deepened his resolve to understand the full scope of what it meant to live without a safety net. The most transformative moment came during an encounter with a young mother and her child. The woman, dressed in threadbare clothes, was begging outside a grocery store with a cardboard sign that read, "Please help. Anything is appreciated." Jonathan watched as countless shoppers hurried past her, some averting their eyes, others muttering dismissive remarks. Unable to ignore the scene, he approached her and offered her the few coins he had collected that day. The woman's gratitude was overwhelming, her tearful thanks resonating with him in a way no accolade from his previous life ever had. She shared her story, a cycle of abuse, eviction, and a desperate attempt to protect her child. Her resilience moved Jonathan deeply, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his own privilege as an unbearable burden. Despite the hardships, Jonathan discovered a profound sense of purpose during his time on the streets. He began documenting his experiences in a small notebook he had salvaged, filling its pages with stories, observations, and reflections. He wrote about the people he met, their struggles, and the systemic issues that perpetuated their suffering. His once narrow view of charity expanded as he came to understand that true change required more than donations. It required empathy, action, and a willingness to challenge the structures that allowed such inequality to persist. As weeks turned into months, Jonathan felt himself changing. The man who had once been defined by his wealth and status was now humbled by the resilience and humanity of those society overlooked. Though he still carried the burden of his secret, he began to question whether his life would ever return to what it once was. He was no longer the same person who had walked out of his mansion weeks ago. The streets had stripped him of his pretense, leaving behind someone raw, vulnerable, and profoundly changed. Jonathan's time as a beggar was nearing an end, not because he felt he had learned all there was to know, but because the weight of his dual life was becoming unbearable. For months, he had walked the streets as an anonymous figure, eating scraps, sleeping in the cold, and finding brief solace in the companionship of his newfound friends. Yet, the secret of his true identity lingered like a phantom, a constant reminder of the life he had temporarily abandoned. The questions loomed larger with each passing day. What would happen when he revealed the truth? How could he reconcile his old life with the new understanding he had gained? The moment of revelation came unexpectedly. One evening, Jonathan's small group of homeless companions was gathered under their familiar bridge, sharing a modest meal of canned soup and stale bread. Marla, ever perceptive, broke the silence with a pointed question. "You're different, you know that? You don't talk about where you came from. You don't seem as broken as the rest of us. So, what's your story?" The group turned to Jonathan, their curiosity evident. For a moment, he hesitated, torn between the desire to maintain his disguise and the urge to be honest with the people who had shown him more kindness and authenticity than anyone in his former life. Finally, Jonathan spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. He confessed everything: his wealth, his decision to disguise himself, and his reasons for living on the streets. The silence that followed was deafening. Marla's sharp eyes softened, Greg looked away, and Benny's expression wavered between shock and betrayal. Jonathan braced himself for their anger, but it was Marla who broke the tension. "You wanted to understand what it's like to be us? Well, now you do. But the question is, what are you going to do with it? The group's reactions were a mix of emotions, from forgiveness to skepticism. But Jonathan knew that Marla's words held the key to his next steps. He couldn't return to his old life as if nothing had changed, nor could he abandon the people who had become his family. With their cautious support, he decided it was time to act on what he had learned. Jonathan's first step was to use his wealth and influence to address the systemic issues that perpetuated poverty in his city. Disguised as a beggar, he had experienced firsthand the barriers that kept people trapped in cycles of homelessness and despair. Armed with this knowledge, he began developing initiatives aimed at providing long-term solutions rather than temporary relief. He used his resources to establish a network of transitional housing, offering not just shelter, but also access to mental health services, job training, and educational opportunities. Each program was designed with input from his homeless companions, ensuring that their voices were at the center of the solutions. Reintegrating into his former life was not easy. When Jonathan returned to his mansion, the opulence felt foreign, almost obscene. The first time he sat at his dining table, surrounded by an array of gourmet dishes, he found himself unable to eat, his mind flashing back to the hunger-stricken faces he had left behind. His staff and acquaintances were bewildered by the changes in him. Gone was the man who had exuded confidence and control. In his place was someone quieter, more introspective, and profoundly altered. The revelation of his time as a beggar sent shockwaves through his social circle. When the story leaked to the press, it became a scandal. Many criticized him for what they saw as a reckless stunt, accusing him of exploiting poverty for personal enlightenment. Yet for every detractor, there were those who praised his courage and authenticity. Jonathan didn't shy away from the controversy. Instead, he used the platform to amplify the voices of those he had met on the streets. He publicly shared the stories of Marla, Greg, Benny, and others, shining a light on the humanity behind the statistics and stereotypes. Jonathan's transformation extended beyond his public actions. He began to live more simply, shedding much of the excess that had defined his previous lifestyle. He sold off several of his properties, channeling the proceeds into his charitable programs. His mansion became a hub for innovation and outreach, with his former dining room converted into a meeting space for social workers, activists, and policy experts. The same space that had once hosted extravagant parties now served as a place where real change was being planned. Despite the progress he was making, Jonathan struggled with guilt and a lingering sense of unworthiness. He couldn't forget the friends he had left behind under the bridge. Returning to them was difficult, as he knew that his reappearance as a wealthy man would inevitably alter their perception of him. When he visited them for the first time after his return to wealth, he came not with grand promises, but with humility. He invited them to participate in the initiatives he was building, offering them roles as advisors and advocates. Their insights became the foundation of his work, ensuring that his efforts remained grounded in the realities of those he sought to help. The final chapter of Jonathan's journey came during a citywide event where he unveiled a new community center dedicated to combating homelessness. The building bore a simple plaque, "To the teachers who walked with me." Standing before the crowd, Jonathan delivered a heartfelt speech, sharing his experiences and the lessons he had learned. He spoke of the resilience, kindness, and humanity of those he had met on the streets, challenging the audience to see the homeless not as a problem to be solved, but as people deserving of dignity and opportunity. As the applause faded, Jonathan looked out at the faces in the crowd and saw Marla, Greg, and Benny standing together. They smiled at him, their expressions a mixture of pride and approval. In that moment, Jonathan realized that his journey was far from over. The work of addressing inequality and building a more compassionate society was ongoing, but he was no longer the man who had once viewed charity as a transaction. He was a man transformed by the people who had shared their lives with him, and he was determined to honor their lessons every day.